Welcome everybody to the 4 o'clock hour on Business Monday. I'm Josh Fenton. We're here at GoLocal right here on beautiful Bassett Street. I am here with Cha-Ching, the money man, Gary Sasse, head of the Hassenfeld Institute at Bryant University. Mr. Sasse, did you have a nice weekend?
Excellent. How was yours?
Excellent. Yes, I moved lots of mulch.
Oh.
Yes, I was one with the earth. But everything was good. Let's jump into it. The state budget looks better than worst case scenario, not great. State in a supposedly a national economic upswing. There's a little worrying numbers. Len Ladaro has some worrying numbers. The revenue numbers were maybe better than worst case scenario, but not spectacular. Your thoughts?
Well, I think we're pretty much where we started. When the governor submitted a budget, she had to close, I forgot the number, but she had to close about $150 million deficit, and I think $50 million this year.
Yep.
And she submitted her tax and spending program, a lot of spending, a lot of new taxes that would close the budget. A number of the proposals, if not dead on arrival, were in not good shape, not very popular budget. And so when you look at what happened with the revenue estimates, you got to give these revenue estimates a lot of credit. They missed by $25 million on a $4 billion budget this year, and they missed on the right side. It was $25 million more than anticipated. And next year is an unbelievable number. I've never seen this close. They adjusted their initial estimate by $2 million on a $4 billion budget. So the revenue was status quo, essentially. And so we're back to debating whether the governor's solution to fix the problem is the one that politically is stomachable, if that's a word, to the General Assembly. And there are a number of items in that we know they don't like.
They don't seem to like them. Word out of the Marble Dome is that things like marijuana's not moving forward. Things like Rhode Island Promise being extended free tuition to students at Rhode Island College will not move forward. Early childhood education, I think, is somewhat still in flux. It's a kind of a lost year. I mean, isn't the fifth year, the first year of a second term, kind of an action year for a governor? And this seems like a little bit of a kiss your cousin lost year.
Well, we'll see what the legislature comes up with. The legislature may have some ideas that will not make it a lost year. But when you think about what the governor submitted in her budget, as I said before, it was really an old-fashioned tax and spend budget. How you taxed everything from Netflix to, I forget all the services they added on, tobacco, hotels.
She tried for beach fees.
They said no. Interior decorators, janitorial services, business services to buildings. And so it was a kind of a litany of different tax increases, $20 million in scoops from revenue that the quasi-independents had saved or held. And some of those obviously are unpopular. And it was used to fund a spending program where there wasn't a lot of dramatic proposals. If the most dramatic proposals was a few $1 million for the Promise program, certainly the pre-K will be more expensive in the out years. So there wasn't a lot in there, and so you found a governor increasing a budget to close a deficit because of the lack of fiscal discipline in prior years. And this goes before, reminder, this is not all the governor's fault. Only have a few nickels and dimes to add new things to the budget, so how can you be very excited?
If there's a collective agreement, I think in many circles, that while Rhode Island is enjoying some level of upswing over the past few years, along with the rest of the country, but we're not changing the fundamentals, right?
We're not.
When do we change the fundamentals? Do we have to wait till it's an absolute nuclear crisis of devastation?
It's a little late now when you work through radioactive, fallout.
Yeah.
I've been one of the critics of Commerce Rhode Island. I'm not critical of their programs. I think there's a place for their programs, but there's also a place for strategic thinking. We were talking about the Brookings study that was done, for the governor and for the Rhode Island Foundation. That
4 or 5 years ago.
That had a strategic, program in place. I'm not sure how much of that, was addressed. So we've essentially had a Commerce Department that's been transactional. Some of the transactions were quite good. Some of the transactions hard to rationalize. But we're veering off course. You know, we never had a strong, we never set a strong course. So you look at certain numbers now, and I don't look at I look at numbers differently than some of the others look at, but I look at the consensus economic forecast, which is the latest official state forecast. Hadn't been published yet. I think it will be published, you know, when the budget comes out, on what's happening to employment, what's happening to unemployment, not over the past 5 years,
Right.
but over the next 5 years. And so these numbers blow your mind. In fiscal year, current fiscal year, it's projected there'll be about 496,000, almost 497,000 jobs. 5 years later, in fiscal 24, about 504,000 jobs. That's a growth of 1.4%. That's a growth of 7,000 jobs. You don't write your mother about that. That's not very good. You look at unemployment. Unemployment currently at 3.8, 3.9. It's projected to be near 5% in 5 years. So the policies we've put in place have not guarded us from a deteriorating economic situation, which are the state's own forecasted numbers. They're not any numbers that one side or one economist is, you know, running some model in the basement and coming up with.
On that note, the Wall Street Journal took the state of Connecticut to the woodshed this past couple days in an editorial relating to their efforts to create an unfriendly environment for the hedge fund industry. And they said, God, this is getting so bad in Connecticut. It's nearly as bad as Rhode Island. Connecticut's second in the Northeast to the slowest growth rate, and listed Rhode Island as having the worst growth rate.
In terms of job growth, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a fact. For the last year, Connecticut had faster job growth than Rhode Island. Ours was about 0.3, theirs is about 0.6. Not, you know, neither of us on an all-star team.
Right.
But yeah, they were outpacing us. Another thing that you have to look at is the growth in the overall economy, because when you analyze the job numbers, you have to.
By the way, 0.3, 0.6 in growth.
Jobs.
U.S. GDP. Well, these are GDP.
No, these are jobs.
Jobs.
But you want to talk about
Go to GDP.
You want to talk about GDP? Over the last 12 months, our GDP, Rhode Island, grew by 0.6%.
0.6%.
We were 47th of the 50 states. I forgot what the 3 states below us were, but we
It's got to be Mississippi. Mississippi's always.
well, I have relatives there, so be careful. But you know, the GDP growth
And the United States was 3.0.
You're close to it,
Yeah.
not quite. And so in the first quarter of this year, our growth in GDP was, again, poor. It was like a half of 1%. So you look at what's happened over the last 12 to 15 months, you see very slow GDP growth, 47th out of 50. You see a projection of future job growth of only adding 7,000 jobs on a base of almost 500,000 over the next 5 years. You see the rate of unemployment going up. And I can go on and on. You know, if you look at March 2019, you know, employment year to date, year to year for that period, we effectively, in keeping the noise out of numbers, we effectively lost almost 3,000 jobs.
Right.
So
5 straight months. Rhode Island's had 5 straight months of job loss.
Okay, so there was some very smart politician that ran on a reform program called Truth in Numbers, and I forget her name. But
You're mocking the governor.
Well, I am. But the fact is, we need a mid-course correction. It's not to say that what we've done was all wrong. It wasn't. But obviously, when you have numbers like this, when you see your GDP, you know, over the last 12 months being 47th out of 50, when your own revenue forecasters project that over the next 5 years we'll add 7,000 jobs. And keep in mind, we had about 6,000 jobs between fiscal 19 and 21. They project almost no growth from 21 through 24. There's a lot of noise in these numbers. You know, the economy is very volatile. So tomorrow morning we wake up and read a headline and things will look much sunnier and better. But this is what we know this afternoon. And if these are the kinds of numbers that you see from different sources, the GDP might have come from Bryant's study, the Commerce forecast. I mean,
Isn't there a danger, too, that this building perception, fostered primarily by the Wall Street Journal analyzing the governors, record and recent proposals becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If the Wall Street Journal keeps saying you're anti-business, or de facto, you anti-business?
No, let me turn it around on you, because up until recently, the national press that this administration in Rhode Island getting was very positive.
Right, and she got the benefit of it in some cases,
But
Johnson & Johnson and GE, et cetera.
Those were important, but they created 75, 100 jobs. They were one-offs. When you say, okay, how did that fit into the overall strategy? What was our strategy on innovation? What was our strategy on technology? What was our strategy as conditions changed? You know, I would like, and I'm sure it exists somewhere, but if it exists somewhere and it's not self-evident, that's a story in itself. What is our get well plan? What is the economic strategy? The economic strategy can't be, as the governor proposed, putting another $100 million of authority in rebuild, you know, Rhode Island and building more real estate. Maybe that's okay as part of the equation, but there are other factors in that equation that need to be looked at. And with these numbers, you have to have that serious kind of conversation. I would hope, and I give people the credit, you know, for thinking about this thing, that it's really well past time to say, okay, we've had 5 bad months, we've had 1 bad year of economic growth based on GDP compared to the other states. You know, what have we done right? Let's build on that. You know, what have we done that hasn't worked out as well as we've liked? How do we get back to some of the fundamentals? And the fundamentals are very clear. The fundamentals are, and this goes back to day one, states compete to be the most productive places for business to operate. And the states that make the most productive use of their people and their natural resources and their capital, you know, draw companies. So what do we have to do to make this place more productive? Because if a company's productive, it's increasing its payrolls, its wages, standard of living is increased. I haven't heard that discussion. I hadn't heard in 4 years or 5, and before that, I don't want to be critical of this one group. I've not heard the old EDC or the new RI Commerce be very much different. I've not heard a conversation about what do we do to improve the productivity in the state? How do we create a climate where businesses can make the most productive use of the resources that are here? And
Are we too reactive? Is it, listen, if developer X, Joe Palino, walks in the door and he's got a project and it looks good and he's got a bank that's willing to finance it up to Y, then we move forward with it, rather than the harder work of creating and supporting very specific sectors that are going to help the state in the long term develop a more vibrant economy. If you go back to the Brookings, it's very specific. I believe there's 6 targets, mostly in the technology, emerging markets, that Brookings look and said, listen, this is what your core strengths are. This is what the regional strengths are. You need to be in these 6 areas.
Well, there's 2 things.
Pharmaceuticals as an example.
First of all, you didn't walk and chew gum. So if a developer walks into your community and says,
Wait. You're saying that the state of Rhode Island needs to walk and chew gum at the same time. In other words, you could build a hotel and foster growth within the pharmaceutical industry simultaneously.
Maybe you can't build 6 or 7 hotels.
Yep.
But certainly, if you're developing an innovation economy, you need, and you don't have no hotel space, you need hotels. But what we've done is we've gone 6 or 7 hotels. So yes, you may need a hotel. Housing may be an issue, but you don't necessarily just use state subsidies to build high-cost housing so people can get on the train and go to Boston.
Right.
So yeah, there needs to be a strategy. Yes, you can walk and chew gum. And the other part of it is so you have to be responsive to a developer or somebody that comes to the state with money and wants to invest in the state. You don't close the door on that person, but at the same time, you act tactically and strategically in how you respond. And my argument is when I look at the Rebuild Rhode Island projects, I see about 30 projects I think they list on their website. I would probably, this is only my opinion, other people have different opinions. My opinion is probably 12 to 14 of those were legitimate, investments maybe that we should have made. That was part of the chewing gum part. But the walking part, what was the strategy? What's the strategy in artificial intelligence? What's the strategy on cybersecurity? And when the Brookings people came out and identified specific industries, you got to be careful there too, because government does a lousy job whether it's this government or government in Mississippi or California, picking winners and losers. But you can't talk about innovation and technology, and then you let the kind of business, the kind of activity, come that's supported, by that. You may get a little more tactical with creating, clusters. So this is not new. It's difficult, and my impression is that we have focused on the transaction and less on the strategy.
We've talked a little bit of that. Last week, the legislative leaders formally introduced, Kate Nagel had sort of broken the story the week earlier, but had formally introduced their legislative package for school reform. And it had many of the things that you had outlined. I think there's questions about how rigorous the new legislative package is on teacher evaluation and whether or not there's really going to be any meat and potatoes on things like graduation standards and things like that. Overall, what was your take?
Very positive, very, very positive. And there are a lot of risks with it. We can talk about the risks and what's positive. The most positive thing to me was that it's systemic, that it dealt not just, the governor's been very good at proposing a program for computers in the schools and
it was holistic. Would it have been better to be a budget article, though, from
No, I think
but what if all the easy ones pass and the difficult ones don't?
We'll see what happens, but it has such overwhelming support from the leadership on both sides that I think the most important thing is that all the stakeholders get a chance to be heard, because the way this legislation surfaced, you hear from different stakeholders, well, I didn't know what was going on, I don't know the details.
Sure.
So it's important that it get a chance to be heard. But it was systemic, dealt with a lot of things. Interesting sidelight, it was rolled out in the state library, not the state room.
Yeah.
Then that's you can take from that what you want. But it dealt with its curriculum frameworks. It makes an effort to...
I think there were a number of messages that it was not in the governor's space, that it was in a legislative space, that it was in a place of learning, not in a place of formality, a few things.
People still use libraries, most people. But the point, being that it dealt with a number of important issues. It dealt with, statewide curriculum frameworks, which, if done well, will align, academic standards with instruction strategies with teachings. It says its theory was to join hands and point fingers and have a friendlier, more helpful, ride instead of being just a regulatory monster.
Yeah.
It actually be a help. It deals with accountability in governments. Here, I think there's some problems. Site-based management, which we all agree with. We'll go back to Bruce Sunland Day when we try to propose that. The intervention strategy could be a little bit cumbersome, but it also deals with teacher certification. Now, to be certified as a teacher, you're going to have to demonstrate not just what you know, that you...
New teachers.
To certify.
But not old teachers.
No, but to certify a teacher, new teacher, you have to demonstrate, not just what you know, but how you can teach. It has some protocols on teacher evaluation, which I'm not clear with. So I mentioned a number of topics that come together as a whole, and you got to give the legislature a lot of credit for doing that. But there are some issues. We know, for example, that to see any results as Massachusetts saw took a while.
Yep.
And there are no measurements in there. So I don't know how they gauge progress, because 10 years you should make...
I think they're intimating that the RICAS test results will be the benchmark.
Well, that's not the only benchmark of progress.
Certainly not.
Resources are a problem too. And you and I have talked about this before. So it's not a question of how much money you're spending, but let me give you a couple of examples of the problem with resources. It fluctuates a lot from year to year. So somebody called me in Smithfield and said 1 year we had a 15% increase in state aid. Next year we had an 18% decrease because of the way assessments grew and a number of things that operate the formula. Well, you can't do site-based management, with those kinds of
variables.
Fluctuations. And the other issue, which wasn't discussed, is where the money is coming from. So we know property tax pays in the state are drained out, but only 35% of the money comes from state support. And so the financing issues are real. It's how much more dependence can you put on the property tax. It's how do you deal with fluctuations. I won't even get into a discussion of whether we're spending enough or not. The other issue, and I thought one of the legislators, I don't recall who said this, was pretty disingenuous. He says it's not a matter of, of money. Well, what you have to demonstrate is that you could, if you're spending money for A right now, that you have the flexibility to take it from A and do something different with it. And, looking at bumping, looking at seniority, looking at a whole number of things, that's not always the case. Looking at debt you have to pay on bonds, they're built-in legacy costs. So to say, oh, we have plenty of money, we can move it around to site-based management, is not factually true. And then the interventions are very expensive. I haven't gone through this yet, but I started an airplane actually to try to map out the interventions, because there's all kind of intervention strategies and turnaround programs. And I don't know if it's efficient or not, or whether it's become very bureaucratic and a paper chase. But anyhow, the kind of intervention strategies that are there are going to take money. If you appoint a receiver, if you appoint an expert, if you want to improve something the school's doing, when you intervene, you can't just take money from other schools in your district. And so you have all those practical problems of flexibility in using money, of flexibility in becoming so bureaucratic that it becomes a paper chase. And so those things have to be discussed and sorted out. And I think they will be. I hope they will be. Because the worst thing we can do is pass what I think is generally a good piece of legislation and not be cognizant of the potential unintended consequences, from that. But is
there enough meat? We've discussed a number of times when the rubber hit the road on what it took to graduate from a Rhode Island high school. And the first time a Barrington parent stuck up their hand and complained that it was too restrictive, the legislature and the state's governance overseeing the schools collapsed.
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because we've had a tradition here of, what you said, just caving every time things get tough. Intervention is going to be very tough. It's going to take prerogatives away from parents. It's going to take prerogatives away from, they speak about school site management, but if you've got a receiver appointed to run your school, you've lost something there.
Yeah.
And there are going to be costs involved. So the first time an expert or a receiver, comes in to help manage your school, there's going to be reaction. Now, I give the leadership a lot of credit, because in their press conference, they said they understood that in the past they had made mistakes. They had started things, same as Massachusetts, and they caved to political pressure. And this time they recognized it had to go on and not cave. The only qualification I would make with that, a lot of them are not going to be there, as this thing becomes to be implemented. So while they could say that, and I think honestly and candidly, with the best of intentions, they don't know who their replacement's going to be, and they don't know their attitude of their replacements, and they don't know the public attitude that if it becomes too bureaucratic and too much of a paper chase, what the public attitudes would be. So,
and doesn't there need to be? I don't want to see that we go from an F to a B, but doesn't there need to be some results? A perception that the system is moving forward after a couple of years. If it lags, if it takes 5 years and RICAS scores are still deficient by the order of magnitude that we realize this year, that frustration will grow on all sides.
Well, at that point, that was my first point about what are your benchmarks? So it's going to take a long time to achieve what you want to achieve. It took a long time. Massachusetts you can't turn these things around overnight. So and they have not. So they have to identify benchmarks. I would like to know, for example, where we're going to be in 3 years.
Right.
We're not going to be in the promised land, but how close to the Red Sea are we going to be? And that's something that's not been done. And those benchmarks become very important. It's not just for academics like me to talk about benchmarks. It's also to ensure that there's a continuity as a new speaker, a new Senate president, new people elected to the legislature, that that you're working against the benchmarks, so the people that come into office are held, they could change benchmarks certainly, but are held accountable to something. And right now, it's only the speaker's good words, the Senate president's good word. I think they're sincere in what they say. I think they really believe it. But they're going to change, and there's no insurance policy with this. The other issue, and this is something that was done in Massachusetts. I just read a book that the people that did the Massachusetts reform came out with. They spent $2 billion over 7 years.
Yeah.
And when you read the bill and look at what's involved in the intervention,
We'll disagree. I think we've already spent the
No,
appropriate $2 billion over 7 years. We just haven't gotten any results.
but it's spent. So the point is, like I tell you, I'm going to go out and buy me a new Mercedes
But
Benz.
I think if you look at spending, and I don't care whose numbers you use, our per pupil spending is right there with Massachusetts. Our salaries for faculty is slightly behind. Almost every single expenditure measure.
But there's three things that you had to consider, and I mentioned them before. One is the predictability of the aid. You can't have a formula work where it's 15%, 18% fluctuations, like the case I mentioned.
No, I think that absolutely, right.
You can't ignore the fact that we are very low in terms of the percentage of state support used to fund education, particularly with high property taxes in the areas that have the most failing schools. So you got a property tax overburden you can't ignore in your funding. You can't ignore the fluctuations I mentioned, and you have to come up with a measure, and I don't know what it is, and I don't know if that, okay, how much flexibility do I have? You say, we've spent this money. Well, if I spend it for pensions, if I spend it for debt service, if I spend it for teachers that I can't get rid of because of seniority and bumping, I don't have that money.
Right.
And so those are the three variables. Yeah, you could run a simplistic thing and say we spent X thousand per pupil, and Massachusetts spent Y thousand per pupil, but unless you consider those 3 points that I just made, you really don't see the whole forest.
What's your expectation? Does this package as a whole pass in these final 5 weeks of the legislative session?
Yeah, I would think it would pass. I would hope they would look at the intervention protocols and make sure that they're not creating this bureaucracy that will draw attention away from education and onto paper. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And I hope there'll be time to look at that. But that's not to change the intent of the legislation. It's really just to make sure it does what you want it to do.
Your friend down in Washington, D.C., I haven't looked at the numbers.
Which one of my friends?
The President Donald Trump.
That's the first time he's ever been referred to my friend.
Let's just take a look. The stock market is down 617 points today based on fears of an ongoing trade war with China. Your take on I think we've now surpassed saber rattling to actually saber using. We are in the midst of a significant trade dispute with the second largest economy in the world.
Right, and there's always a grain of truth in what this president says, but there's always a big gap between that little grain and reality. And so, yeah, China been a bad player, for a lot of reasons. You're not going to beat China unless you work with other nations. And so what do? We
unilaterally.
We get rid of the TPP.
Yep.
We're fighting with our NATO allies, as a common market. And so we have no allies. We're out there by ourselves. That's the first problem. The second problem is I don't think the president has a clue into how tariff works. So if I'm an importer, let's say I'm General Motors, and I import spark plugs, and I cost $100 for a box of spark plugs, and you put a 25% tariff in, well, then now the spark plugs cost $125. The guy that sold me the spark plug gets 100, and the government gets the 25. But me as a consumer, when I go buy that new Chevrolet, I'm paying $125 for the spark plug, not 100. And there were some numbers. Interesting you ask, because some of the work I was doing looking at this, and these numbers, the tariff we guess, and we being the royal we for the time being, will cost about $2,200 per family. If we don't get out of this mess pretty quick, it means about 2.2 million jobs. If your wife goes into the appliance store tomorrow and purchases a washing machine, she's going to pay I can tell you the exact number. She's going to pay $86 more on that washing machine. And when you get the reactions from the stock market, even though the economy is doing well, and I think this economy hasn't performed this well in a long time, you really have to know what you're doing on tariffs. And as a free trade, classical, conservative kind of person, these kind of tariffs scared me because you can posture so long, but it's like two teenagers in a car. Who's gonna call chicken first?
Let me argue the other side. For decades, and I mean decades, through both Republican and Democratic presidents, China especially, more so than almost any other
Yeah.
significant country, have violated every trade agreement, have violated every copyright, have violated every patent agreement, have consistently stole our best technology at every opportunity to the detriment of hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, out of the U.S. economy, and created competitors for U.S. companies that did all the hard work and came up with the innovation.
And
So doesn't somebody at some point
absolutely.
need to draw the line in the sand
Yeah.
and back it up? We learned in Syria that just drawing the line in the sand doesn't necessarily work
but
with
you have
with
to-
real countries.
You have to ask the question about how when do you begin to cut off your nose to spite your face? And that's why I said there was a kernel of truth in what the president was proposing. We have to stand up to China. The administration should get a lot of credit standing up to China, but you have to be skilled in the negotiations. You cannot.
They seem to think they had a trade agreement 10 days ago.
I don't no reason to doubt him, but it didn't work. So you have to have a fallback strategy. If the fallback strategy is to bluster and say we will have 25% tariffs, and next week add another $325 billion worth of goods subject to the tariff, the question always becomes, well, that's not going to work for very long. The numbers just
Might balance the budget.
well, I don't know about that. But what do you have confidence? This is a question about leadership. Do you have confidence that there's a reasonable fallback strategy? And what I've seen, I don't have that same confidence. I don't have any question. I agree 100% with you that we needed to stand up to China. Now, are we going to be able to execute this strategy? And tariffs, ever since Smooth-Hawley, have been questionable.
What's interesting about the tariff discussion is there must be so much truth to it because the Democrats have been very reluctant to criticize or defend China in this dispute. So I think there is.
Oh, Schumer's agreed with the president.
Yeah, I think there's a collective thought process that, listen, it may not be the perfect strategy, but it's about time somebody had a strategy.
Well, time will tell, but if I was running for president, I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Iowa right now, because anybody that grows soybeans is getting whacked, and they vote.
Last question, we've already run late. Do you expect Joe Biden to be the Democratic? We're not going to hold you to it. We're not sports betting over at Twin River on this. Do you think Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee?
Right now, he's certainly outpacing his opposition. So if based on polls, but it's so early to tell. He's going to be on the stage. We'll see what he does. But based on this, that I think Democrats have come to a realization that the job one is defeating Trump. Job one is not Medicare for all.
Yeah.
Job one is not the new Green Deal. And if they can stay on course and they make their decision based on who they think is most likely.
So 4 years of Joe Biden is far better than another 4 years of Donald Trump.
I would hope that Donald Trump is no longer president was it January 2021? Yeah.
Gary Sasse, the Money Man, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate the insights into the state budget, education reform, tax policy in the state of Rhode Island, and other legislative initiatives. We will be back tomorrow. Big happenings at the State House tomorrow. A very, very significant vote in key Senate committee on the leading abortion rights bill. That is the hot spot, maybe of this entire legislative season, and we'll see where that goes. That was not a vote that was expected to come up. It is coming up. We'll see how that cuts. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow. Go Local Live.